Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Troy Remick. I am a Director of Conservation Planning and Permitting at ICF, and I'm going to spend a little time today just walking through my career, my educational background, and a little bit about the work that I do now. I am a biologist by training and a conservation planner. I work at ICF, which is a private consulting firm based actually on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., but has a large presence on the West Coast. And I specialize in Endangered Species Act permitting. And all of the work that I do is in Washington State, Oregon, and California. So primarily a West Coast based emphasis for me. So for starters, I went to college in northeastern Missouri at a college called Truman State University. I grew up in the middle part of the country. I'm from Nebraska originally, and so found my way to Missouri in Truman State, and actually majored in biology there, and earned both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree while I was there. So I was actually at Truman for a total of 7 years straight. And while I was there, a little bit of an evolution occurred, at least in my sort of scientific interests. When I went to college, I thought I would probably pursue something in the realm of medical research. I was certainly interested in science coming out of high school, and was interested in the idea of doing research and assumed that I would probably end up doing that in a lab somewhere someday. While I was in college, I realized I really liked classes related to ecology, things like mammalogy and ecology and evolutionary biology, ornithology. And before I got to college, I hadn't really considered that there were even classes on those things, much less that it would be something I would be interested in maybe pursuing a career in the future. A couple of really interesting things happened while I was there. One was during my undergraduate years, I had the opportunity to go and spend a few weeks one summer in the Chiricahua Mountains of southeastern Arizona at the Southwest Research Station. And I took part in a 3-week-long research study on birds. We basically just went out and watched birds every day. And I sort of thought to myself, huh, I'm pretty good at this. I really enjoy it. And I wonder if I could actually make a career out of it. So as I went on through my undergraduate, right between my when I finished my undergraduate years before I started my graduate work, I actually took a job with North Carolina State University for the summer studying hooded warblers and black-throated blue warblers. That's the two species you see on the screen there, and this is in the mountains of western North Carolina. I went out there for the summer and spent some time searching for nests of these birds, studying nesting behaviors, and just fell in love with the whole idea of birds and bird research and nesting behavior in birds. And at that point in time, it was pretty clear to me that I definitely wanted to pursue something in the realm of natural resources or ecology if I could make it work. And so I began thinking a little bit more critically about what that would really look like for me. My next step in that process was to finish my master's work. Again, I was still at Truman, and my advisor at the time was doing research on the evolution of birdsong in the Caribbean, and was looking at differences in birdsong for a few species on different islands, really across the Caribbean. And that, in one particular summer, she was headed to the Bahamas to record bird songs on a series of places. And so I actually got some grant funding to spend time on a little island called Abaco, which the arrow is pointing to there in the slide, and was specifically interested in studying a species of Spindalis, the western Spindalis, in the Bahamas, and again focused on the nesting behavior of the species. And the reason why I was interested in it was because there was at the time absolutely nothing known about the species. The one thing that people did know was that on virtually every island, this species tended to behave differently. They nested in different trees at different heights. They actually foraged on different things as far as people understood, but it was all really just anecdotal observations, and there was no real hard research that had been done on the species. Now, of course, you didn't really have to twist my arm to go and do research in the Bahamas for a year, actually 2 summers. And the time I spent there was actually pretty eye-opening for two reasons. One, when I got there, I realized that everything that we thought we knew about the species was completely wrong, and the nesting behavior of the species was really the opposite of what people had anticipated, which was, I guess, good news and bad news because it was something that we were certainly learning. The bad news was it was nesting about 50 feet up in pine trees in places where it was really impossible to do much actual nest monitoring. So we still, at that point, when I was done with my work, we knew much more about where they were nesting and their the relationship between the male and the female, but very little about their actual nesting behavior, how many eggs they laid, how many young they had. And actually now, gosh, 20 years later, it's still relatively unknown. The species is still relatively unstudied. Another thing really dawned on me when I was doing my graduate research in the Bahamas, and that was, while I really enjoyed being out there and doing the research and learning about the birds, it was clear to me that the research I was doing didn't really have much real world application. So there wasn't anybody really, asking for that information. It wasn't the information I was learning or gaining wasn't necessarily going to change how management was occurring on the landscape. It wasn't necessarily going to influence whether or not places were going to be conserved or not. It was sort of just research for research's sake, which was interesting, but I was leaving that master's program thinking I definitely really want to work on something that is a little bit more applied and actually can influence, how we conserve habitats in the future. Set out to do that and went on a little bit of a circuitous route from that point to get to where I am now. I actually finished my graduate work. I mentioned I had been at Truman for 7 years, and I thought I've been in school for a long time. It's time to get out there and start doing some actual work on the ground. So I headed for Alaska. Initially, I actually went to Alaska to work as a biologist on fishing boats and did that for a while. And then got a job with the Alaska Bird Observatory in Fairbanks, where I again studied nesting bird behaviors, looking at the effects of loud noises, in this case, jet engine noises from Eielson Air Force Base on the nesting behavior of birds. So we did that for about a year, and then found my way down to California to what was then called the Point Reyes Bird Observatory and is now called Point Blue. There, I was actually out in the shrub steppe habitats of northeastern California studying sage sparrows and brewer sparrows and sage grouse and looking at how rangeland management and other issues in shrub steppe habitats like infiltration of cheatgrass, encroachment of juniper was influencing bird behaviors and bird habitat in that location. So I did that for a while and then took a job, my first job in consulting, which was with Thunderbird Wildlife Consulting in northeastern Wyoming. And this was probably where I started doing my most applied field work. We were doing work primarily for the oil and gas industry and the coal industry, and doing habitat surveys, looking for raptor nests, monitoring raptor nests, surveying for bald eagle nests and bald eagle winter roost sites, sage grouse nests, black-footed ferrets, a whole bunch of things. And the idea was that we were sort of setting a baseline for locations where oil and gas development was going to occur, and then monitoring things along the way to determine whether or not those new oil and gas developments were having an effect on the species, and then the oil and gas companies would make some decisions based on our work, in terms of how to minimize those effects or mitigate those effects over time. So I spent a lot of time in the field for that period of time in some really beautiful places in northeastern Wyoming. And that was a time when I was, the work I was doing was really fulfilling and I was really enjoying myself. But I realized that I was doing a lot of work, but I wasn't really involved in the decision making. I wasn't really in the room when people were making decisions about what kinds of surveys needed to be done, what kinds of conservation actions needed to be implemented to minimize and mitigate effects on these species. And I really began thinking that, while it's great being out in the field and, doing that field work, I really wanted to be involved in some of those those higher level decision-making processes that were informing what the long-term outcomes would be. So I started looking for a position that really spent more time in permitting and really thinking about long-term permitting in particular. And I took a job with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission as their Threatened and Endangered Species Coordinator. I did that for a little while. And in Nebraska, that primarily meant working as a state agency, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that as projects were developed and built, that they were, again, minimizing effects on listed species. There aren't a lot of listed species in Nebraska, but there are a few. And a lot of my work centered on the Platte River, which runs through the center of Nebraska, species like interior least terns, interior piping plovers, pallid sturgeons, lake sturgeons, and so forth. And so those were the species that I spent a lot of time working with while I was in Nebraska. And then an interesting thing happened. I was actually doing some work for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and I met somebody who worked for ICF out in California, and found out that they had a position available in their San Jose, California office. That was back in 2006. So I applied for a job with ICF, and I've been with ICF ever since. So I've been there about 15 or 16 years. And when I started with ICF, I was hired as a staff biologist. So, basically going back, doing some field work again, assessing effects, potential effects on species, mostly listed species again, sometimes species that were not listed but were maybe rare or otherwise sensitive. There are a lot of those species in California. As I did that, I became more experienced with Endangered Species Act permitting and compliance. Did a lot of individual permits under the Endangered Species Act for individual projects. And then started working on regional conservation planning efforts. And these are sort of long-term looks at what's going to happen in a region, maybe say like a county, what's going to happen in a county over a long period of time, and how is that going to affect threatened and endangered species, and how can we think of a long-term conservation strategy that will minimize and mitigate those effects. So rather than focusing on an individual project, we're really focusing on a group of projects in a larger area over a longer period of time. So that seemed to me like a much smarter way to do things, and certainly a much more proactive way to think about, how does the human environment interact with the ecological environment. So I really started focusing my time on those. I now manage several projects like that are focused on Endangered Species Act compliance. And the projects really are across a wide array of clients or project types, everything from urban development, local planning, so cities, cities and counties, even states, how they plan for long-term urban development and growth. And I'll talk about an example of one of those a little bit later. I do quite a bit of work in the forestry sector, particularly in Oregon, and I'll give you an example of one of those projects as well. And then increasingly a lot of work in renewable energy, so solar and wind development. You can imagine that while we are really interested in transitioning to renewable energy, whenever you put a wind farm or a solar facility on the ground, if there are threatened and endangered species there, you still have to think about the effects that you're having on the species. And a lot of those energy projects are in the desert, and there's a lot of really sensitive plants and animals in the desert that we're trying to plan for. So I do a lot of work in solar and wind. Still do a little bit of work in coal and natural gas, although not as much anymore. And then, of course, increasing amounts of work in the transportation sector as we build new highways and trains and so forth. Oftentimes, those long linear projects do end up, at least at some point, running through some habitat for threatened and endangered species. So it's very common that transportation projects need to have some sort of permitting. Now, as my career has kind of evolved a little bit over time, the one thing that I was really interested in, as I mentioned, was like, how can I get in the room and be really part of the decision-making process? And so one of the things that I've been striving for over time was to really figure out how can I help to sort of be the center of the action, if you will, the center of the decision-making process. And really, these long-term conservation planning efforts epitomize that. And that's really the work that I do today, is focused on bringing people together, bringing federal regulatory agencies together with local or state officials that have kind of long-term economic goals, and figuring out how can we combine those fields into these long-term, more sustainable strategies. Before we get into those examples, I do want to just kind of think for a minute about the work that I do and sort of the need for that work. And I titled this slide Job Security because I think that I feel like I do have job security, mainly because unfortunately we're always adding more species to the threatened and endangered species list. We rarely take them off, although we do occasionally. And we also, we're adding more people to the planet, and those people need places to work and places to live and roads to drive on. And so we're constantly building more human infrastructure on the landscape. And my job really comes in when those two things intersect. So any project, where there is a potential for it to result in effects to species listed on the Endangered Species Act, that's where a person in my position, may get involved to really help kind of figure out how do you do that in a smart way. Basically, the project proponents in that case need to demonstrate that they can either avoid the effects to the listed species, or they get a permit from either the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. Basically, easy way to think about that is it a terrestrial species or aquatic species like a fish? And one of those two agencies will have jurisdiction over the species, so that's why they have different permitting authorities. And then, if they do get a permit, they need to demonstrate that they are minimizing and mitigating those effects. And so that's where I come in. I sort of help them with all of that, thinking about the strategy behind what's the best way to build the project, so you can minimize, maybe avoid or minimize your effects. And then if you have to get a permit, I sort of help them think through the permitting process, help them find the mitigation land, figure out how to manage that land and monitor it, for example, all of the requirements that are built into the permitting process. That's what I help them do. So let me give you a couple of examples where this really, really comes to a head. So the first one that I'll talk about is the Bush Prairie Habitat Conservation Plan, and this is in kind of the western part of Washington. There you can see on the map. This is the state of Washington, and this is Thurston County, which is kind of in what we call the South Sound Prairies part of Washington. So Puget Sound is here, South Sound Prairies is here, and then the city of Tumwater is a little city right inside of this larger Thurston County. It's about 23,000 people currently, and they plan to really about double in size over the next 30 years, which isn't, that's not a lot of people. It's not a huge city, but it is an urban growth center in the state of Washington. And one of the things that the state of Washington does is they've selected about 20 locations, 20 cities or kind of regional locations within the city where they really want to create incentives for urban growth to occur in those places. And that really means like creating more jobs, make sure there's plenty of housing available. And it's really a long-term and a very interesting vision about how to do kind of better land preservation or land conservation over time. And that is to concentrate where people live and work in particular locations so that you can then preserve those more natural areas, outside of those urban growth centers, for recreation and clean water and clean air and all the other things that come along with that. So it's a great long-term strategy. And it works most of the time. In the city of Tumwater, the thing that is really interesting is that they have a pocket gopher problem. So there's a species of pocket gopher that only lives in this sort of South Puget Sound area called the Mazama pocket gopher. It was listed as threatened back in 2012, and there are actually 4 subspecies of Mazama pocket gopher. And the 4 subspecies are sort of spread out around the South Puget Sound area, and each of the individual subspecies is listed in its own right. So it's not just that the Mazama pocket gopher is listed. There's actually 4 subspecies that are listed under the Endangered Species Act in this case. Well, one of those subspecies is the Olympia pocket gopher, and its range overlaps almost exactly with the city of Tumwater's urban development boundary. And you can see in the map on the right here, number one, you can see that there is a cute picture of a pocket gopher. And then this outline in green, which I'm outlining with my cursor here, that's the city of Tumwater's boundary, right? So that's the city limits. And all of the other colors you see here, the green shading you see, those are areas that are occupied by Olympia pocket gopher. So we know they're there because surveys have been done. And then there are these areas that are blue, which are areas that we assume have a high potential to be occupied. We haven't surveyed them, but based on the soils and the types of grasses that are there and their proximity to the areas that we know are occupied, we think they probably have pocket gophers too. The areas showing in yellow have a lower probability. They still have the proper soils and the proper grasses and land cover types, but they're just further away from these occupied areas. And pocket gophers can only move so far. So that's why the yellow areas are shown as a lower probability. But the one thing you can see is that a little hard to see on this map, but these areas here, like where I'm circling, those are all already urbanized. That's where the 23,000 people live and work currently. And if they're going to double in size, you can imagine that the only place to go to build new houses and to build new businesses and roads are these places where there are Olympia pocket gophers currently persisting. Now, the interesting thing about that is you can imagine if you think about pocket gophers, they love flat, dry areas, and the other thing that loves flat, dry areas are people that build houses or people that build buildings or roads. So there is really a direct conflict here in the city of Tumwater between habitat for, in this case, a threatened species, and places where the city wants to, invest money for economic development. So it really is a clash in this case of economics versus ecology in some senses. So the HCP, the Habitat Conservation Plan that I've been working on with them for a couple of years, what it basically does is we've looked out over the next 30 years, and there are some pretty good estimates for not only how much the city is planning to grow, but where the city is planning to go. So where are those new roads and houses and businesses going to be built? So we have that. We know something about where there's potentially Olympia pocket gophers, and we just simply do an overlay, a GIS overlay, and come up with an estimate for how many acres of pocket gopher habitat are likely to be lost over time. And then we come up with a strategy for buying some pocket gopher habitat as mitigation land and managing it and monitoring it to make sure that our management is working. And then we think about, well, how much would it cost if we wanted to buy all of that land and manage it and monitor it over the course of a 30-year period? And then we just simply divide that by the number of acres that are expected to be developed, and we come up with a pocket gopher habitat conversion fee. And then what happens is, if somebody in the city of Tumwater wants to build something new, they'll figure out how many acres of pocket gopher habitat they're going to affect. They'll pay the city a pocket gopher habitat conversion fee. The city will take that money and lump it with money from other projects that are doing the same thing, and then go out and buy mitigation land and do management activities and do things that are going to help recover the Olympia pocket gopher in the area. So it really is kind of making sure that the mitigation or the conservation for Olympia pocket gopher is staying ahead of the impacts to the species over time. So again, kind of smart planning or smart growth from a conservation perspective. Now, another example is in Western Oregon. And so the Western Oregon State Forest Habitat Conservation Plan, this is something that I've been working on again for a couple of years. And the Oregon Department of Forestry manages about 700,000 acres of state forest land in Western Oregon. And it's a little hard to see on this map, but this is the western part of the state of Oregon. Here's all of Oregon up here. And you can see these areas showing up in green. There's a big blob of green here, and then a couple as you go down. And if you squint, you can even see a couple further down. Those are all public forest lands, state forest lands in Western Oregon. And the Oregon Department of Forestry, there's the picture of the Habitat Conservation Plan that we've been working on. They have really a charge to do three things. Because these are public forests, they are state forests, and so they are charged with doing really three things on behalf of all Oregonians. One is to provide social benefits on the state lands. The second is to provide economic benefits, and the third is to provide ecological benefits. And so this really is truly what sometimes is referred to, kind of a triple bottom line process, where they're trying to truly balance. Their job is to truly balance these three interest areas on state forest lands. And so you can imagine that if in this simple scenario, if you are harvesting too many trees in too many places and removing too much species habitat, you would be meeting the economic goal and maybe even the social goal, but you would not be meeting the ecological goal. The other side of that coin would be if you were not harvesting anywhere, you would be meeting the ecological goal, but you certainly wouldn't be meeting the economic goal, and you probably wouldn't be meeting the social goal. So you would always be a little bit out of balance. So what they're constantly striving to do is maintain the balance between those three areas. So the HCP helps in one regard, because the complicating factor here in meeting really any of those three goals is the fact that there are quite a few threatened and endangered species that persists on state forests in Oregon, and really on forests across the Northwest. And many of you are probably familiar with some of these. On this slide, I'm showing the northern spotted owl on top, Marbled murrelet in the middle, and then Oregon coast coho at the bottom. These are 3 species of actually 17 species that we address in this Western Oregon State Forest Habitat Conservation Plan. There's 10 fish species that we address in the plan, and 7 wildlife species. And beyond the northern spotted owl and marbled murrelet, there's a couple of species of salamander, and the red tree vole is also addressed in this plan. So we're thinking about over the long term, just like in the other plans that I've talked about, over the long term, what is the Oregon Department of Forestry's goals for timber harvest on these public lands? And how can we meet those goals and provide the social benefits that come along with meeting those goals and the economic benefits, but also retain some ecological value on state forests? And that's really what the conservation plan is trying to address. So a simple way to explain this, and there's certainly a much more complex plan than this, but this is showing kind of the northwestern corner of Oregon, and everything you see here is in either pink or kind of the greenish colors are state forest lands. And one of the kind of central things that we have included in this habitat conservation plan is basically to take about half of the state forest land and manage it primarily for the needs of species, and take the other half and manage it primarily to generate economic value from timber harvest. So what you see here on this graphic, and again, apologies, it's a little bit small, but of all of these state forest lands that are shown here, you can see the pink areas. Those are the areas where there will be more of a focus on timber harvest, more of a focus on economic development. Those that are in this kind of greenish turquoise color, those are called habitat conservation areas. And those are basically areas where the Oregon Department of Forestry will focus on managing the forest for species values, for ecological values. Now, the third part of that stool, social, which we talked about in the last slide, it kind of overlays both of those things, because there are certainly social aspects related to economic benefits. People need jobs. The counties in Oregon get revenue from timber harvest, and they use that money to provide services to the people of Oregon. So that's another social aspect. People also like to go out and do recreation in the forest. So that's another social benefit. And you can imagine that by and large, they probably like to go out and do recreation in forests that are, old and healthy, and maybe less so in those that have recently been harvested or in a clear-cut scenario. And so there is a social aspect to the ecological conservation as well. So very simply, we have kind of divided the forest up here. We have half of it focused on timber harvest and half of it focused on species management, and you can see that depicted here. And so it really is kind of a grand compromise. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if they harvested trees on all of this forest, they would make more money. If they, on the other hand, if they put all of this in sort of an ecological reserve, they would make really no money. And in both of those cases, they would be out of balance with their charge to meet the social, economic, and ecological goals for the state of Oregon. So the HCP really does strive to make that compromise, and you can imagine that when we're going through the process, we really are thinking about all of the interests, all of either the public interests or government interests, the state agencies, of course, and how they're thinking about, in this case, what should be happening on state forest lands in Oregon. So with that, I'm going to end. I know you probably will have some questions, and I think that that's great. I hope that this was helpful and give you some sense of, the work that I do, but also just how I got to the place where I am currently, and the way that I think about, kind of institutionalizing conservation over the long term, and really Endangered Species Act permitting in general. It's something that I find, really exciting. Every day is different, which I like. And the one thing that surprises me about it, that I probably didn't know when I was in college, is that I spend way more time working with people, than I do with animals, which maybe isn't where I wanted to end up, but I definitely feel like I'm having more of an influence on the outcomes now than maybe I did back when I was only doing field work, for example. So that's something that I like and I find really fulfilling. So thank you.